Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In the course of her discussion of what she calls the antinomies of action, Simone de Beauvoir in the Ethics of Ambiguity is going to highlight a certain contempt that some people have, and it's making use of their own freedom as human beings directed against other human beings, perhaps also against themselves. And there's an interesting, we could say, interplay here between contempt for the individual human being and contempt for humanity as such, what we might call the collective, to use a term that she is invoking here. And she begins this discussion by saying, in one sense, the individual, as a matter of fact, is not very much, and we can understand the misanthrope who in 1939, at the beginning of the war, declared, after all, when you look at people one by one, it doesn't seem so awful a thing to make war upon them. And why would she say, okay, this is an understandable position, which, by the way, does not mean that she's endorsing it, right? It's possible to understand a position without agreeing to it. She says that, the individual, when they're reduced to what she calls pure facticity, and this is a term that the existentialists use to mean just what it is that we are at the time, not considering us as beings that can transcend that situation. So she says, reduced to pure facticity, congealed in his immanence. Immanence is, again, just being right here, right now, cut off from his future, deprived of his transcendence and of the world with which that transcendence discloses. A human being no longer appears as anything more than what? A thing among things which can be subtracted from the collectivity of other things without its leaving upon the earth any trace of its absence. Now, of course, in the immediate removal, there's a trace of its absence, but not over time, right? They don't matter because they're just a thing. You could get rid of them altogether. You could replace them with another thing. They're not a person, we might say, right? And so if you look at people in that way, well, then they're not worth very much at all. She says you can actually multiply this paltry existence, paltry means small, by thousands of copies, and its insignificance remains. Mathematics teaches us 0 multiplied by any finite number remains 0. And she says it may, in fact, be possible that the wretchedness of each element is affirmed by this futile expansion. And then she's going to give examples of dehumanization of people who are in, terrible circumstances. So she says, horror is sometimes self-destructive before the photographs of the charnel houses. These are the dead houses of Buchenwald and Dachau, these extermination camps, and of the ditches strewn with bones. When you look at it, it takes on, as she says, the aspect of indifference. How much can you look at it before you feel sort of detached from it? That decomposed, that animal flesh seems so essentially doomed to decay, one can no longer even regret it has fulfilled its destiny, right? So she goes on and says that when we look at the people who have been treated in this way, Sometimes they themselves no longer see themselves and their comrades as anything more than animals whose life or desires were no longer justified by anything, whose very revolts were the agitation of animals. And she says, in order to perceive human being through these humiliated bodies, you had to be sustained by something that was transcending the situation. She gives you 3 examples. Very interesting, too. She says political faith could do that, intellectual pride, or notice this, an atheist philosopher, or Christian charity, Christian love for other people. And she says this is why the Nazis, and we could say this about so many other movements that aim to efface humanity, were so systematically relentless in casting into abjection, lowering, not just in their own eyes, but for the people that were being lowered in their eyes, the people who they wanted to destroy. The disgust which the victims felt in regard to themselves stifled the voice of revolt and justified the executioners in their own eyes. And she says all oppressive regimes do this through the degradation of those who they oppress, right? And she talks about in her own time colonists, the French, who are, looking down on the Arabs, and the more badly off the Arabs are, the more the French can look down on them and say, see, these miserable people, we don't have to do anything for them. As a matter of fact, it would be better if they simply disappeared. And this is, in fact, what Americans did with Native Americans. As, the Manifest Destiny thing moved west. You can see the same logic there, and we can see this in so many other ways as well. And then she brings up something that she's not trying to romanticize this at all. She brings up something really important that provides a kind of counterexample. She says, there were children who played and laughed, and their smile exposed the lie of their oppressors. Why? It was an appeal and a promise. It projected a future before the child, a human future. And then she dwells on this a bit. If in all oppressed countries a child's face is so moving, it's not that the child is more moving or has more of a right to happiness than the others. And here I'm going to pause for just a moment and bring up a rather strange thing that somebody who I remembered said. Somebody who had grown up in Chicago, interestingly, thought that he was Polish until much later discovered that he was actually, in his ethnicity, Russian Jewish, and on his mother's side. And this was so ironic because he was a raging anti-Semite whose only problem with the Holocaust, as he said it, was that they killed children because they were innocent but older people were not. Simone de Beauvoir is saying that's kind of a misguided way of looking at things. What are we seeing in the child's face, in their play, and their laughter? The living affirmation of human transcendence. The fact that we are more than just what we happen to be right now or what we've been reduced to. What contempt shows us as and tries to say this is the only reality for these people. Then she begins talking about the tyrant. And we could think about this not just in terms of political tyranny. We could think about this in terms of all sorts of other power relations, economic, for example. We could think about this in terms of how people treat each other in romantic relationships and all sorts of other things as well, or in families. She says the tyrant asserts themselves as a transcendence, as something who can always be more and who can at any moment be more. And he considers others as pure immanences. He arrogates to himself the right to treat them like cattle, to treat them like things, right? And she says, we see the sophism on which his conduct is based, the ambiguous condition which is that of all human beings, being transcendent and immanent at the same time, a very important idea of existentialist philosophy. He retains for himself the only aspect of a transcendence which is capable of justifying itself. For the others, the contingent an unjustified aspect of immanence. And she says that kind of contempt for human beings, for humanity, is convenient, but it's also dangerous. This can confirm human beings in a hopeless resignation, but not incite them to struggle and sacrifice which is consented to with their life. And we see this in certain times when people lose their willingness to live. However, the tyrant has a set of approaches that allow them to, we could say, alleviate this. One is that they direct this contempt at more specific others rather than at the entirety of their collectivity. So, for example, the Jew, the Negro, the native, they enclose them in their immanence. And it allows people to say, well, at least I'm not one of them. It's okay if we persecute them, take away their property, treat them as not even citizens, let alone second-class citizens, right? And she goes on and she says, he doesn't do this to everybody. What about soldiers and subordinates? Even them he's going to treat as immanent, but as having the possibility of transcendence, but only in a certain way. Not as actual individuals, but as individuals who sacrifice themselves for the collectivity, which the tyrant happens to be the stand-in for, right? And she says, this is one of the aspects of the doctrine of Hegel. So what is the doctrine of Hegel? That the individual has their meaning, their significance, their transcendence in being part of the whole, the totality, and being directed by it and probably having to sacrifice for it. She says, this is one of the aspects of the doctrine of Hegel which dictatorial regimes readily make use of. And now notice the next thing she says here. It is a point at which fascist ideology, this is shortly after the war, has ended, fought against the fascists, and Marxist ideology, Soviet Union is still there, right? She and Sartre are, in fact, Marxists, and breaking from some of their other existentialist friends not too long ago over what the attitude towards the party ought to be, right? This is a point where fascist ideology and Marxist ideology converge. A doctrine which aims at the liberation of human beings cannot rest on a contempt for the individual, but it can propose to him no other salvation than his subordination to the collectivity, right? So even the rationalist Marxist approach is really falling into this and is showing a contempt for human beings. She goes on and, she talks about this as sort of a Hegelian problematic. In Hegel, the individual is only an abstract moment in the history of absolute mind, right? And she gives some long explanation of this, and she says, that doesn't work, and there's actually problems within Hegel that arise. Why? Because the essential moment of Hegelian ethics is the moment when consciousnesses recognize each other. And you might think, the master-slave dialectic, I know all about that. If you read the rest of the phenomenology, recognition, anerkennen, which is only in its crudest form in the master-slave dialectic, is getting further and further and further developed. But Hegel never really does manage to bring it off. And we see that there's some real, difficulties with this. And she gets a bit more concrete. Hegel's pretty philosophical. She is actually going to say nihilistic pessimism, which was, characteristic of fascism, but isn't restricted to it, and rationalistic optimism, which is distinctive of the Marxism of her time, but there's other movements as well that could fit in with this, fail in two things. One is their effort to, as she says, juggle away the bitter truth of sacrifice. What is the bitter truth of sacrifice? If you're going to call it a sacrifice, there has to be something worth sacrificing for. And if you're going to claim that it's the tyrant or the state or something like that, or history or, anything along those lines, you're asking people to sacrifice for something that isn't worth sacrificing for. And it's not that it isn't a sacrifice, it's rather it becomes a meaningless, valueless sacrifice. And these ways of, looking at things also don't give anybody a reason why the hell they should sacrifice. They have to rely on what she calls mystification in order to make that work. And then she's going to tell us, interestingly, this is what democratic societies actually understand. Why? In order for this world to have any importance, in order for our undertaking to have a meaning and be worthy of sacrifices, we must affirm the concrete and particular thickness of this world and the individual reality of our projects and ourselves. And not just our projects, other people's projects as well. So she says democratic societies, and she's not making any sort of they're perfect or anything like that. They strive to confirm citizens in their feeling of individual value, right? The rituals of justice imperfectly embody this, right? And she goes on and says that they attempt to reestablish the individual within their rights, to restore dignity to people after crises take place. So democratic societies, although they don't do this in any really super efficient way, do something different than totalitarian or dictatorial societies do. And she says, if the individual is set up as a unique and irreducible value, then the word sacrifice regains all its meaning. What a person loses in renouncing their plans, their future, and their life no longer appears as a negligible thing. You can sacrifice yourself for your family, for your homeland, and it could actually mean something because you are choosing to do it, not just being forced into it or tricked into it. And the future that you're, depriving yourself of is a future in which other people can have meaning in their lives. And there's more to this as well. She says that if individuals recognize themselves in their differences, not just in being a member of the state, or a good party member, individual relations are established between them, and each one becomes irreplaceable for a few others. Not for the entire society, not for everybody, but for a few others. My wife is irreplaceable for me, right? I hope I am also equally irreplaceable for her. And I don't have to be irreplaceable for you in the same way, right? As a matter of fact, it might be the case that I wind up outliving everybody and not being irreplaceable for anybody except, in parasocial relationships. But the possibility of this is quite important, right? So this is something that a collectivist conception of human beings, as she calls it, doesn't really offer as an option. And in doing so, it shows contempt for humanity and individuals, even when it claims to be benefiting the human race or the individuals under its purview. So, very important set of clarifications being developed by her in this section about both, who has contempt and shows contempt for humanity and individuals, and how we would possibly move beyond that in thinking about these instances of transcendence and in promoting some sort of democratic society.